Hello, everyone. It's Fiona Marks here from fionamarks.com, and I am so happy to be with Fernando again. Would you like to introduce yourself, Fernando?
Hello, Fiona. Thank you very much for inviting me once again to your channel. My name is Fernando Raul Castro Alvarez, and I try to be an astrologer in this modern world.
Yes, yes. And can you tell us your website, please, Fernando?
Sure. My website is Fernando Raul, FernandoRaul, astrology.com, and I have all my consultations there. It's a Spanish speaking website, but you can use Google Translate.
Oh, I thought it was in English. Maybe my Google is smart enough that it just did that in.
Oh, probably. Who knows?
Yeah,
I
I
mean,
think so.
sooner or later, everything's gonna be automatically translated
Yes.
due to the algorithms and AI. I mean, that's coming probably this decade of the 20s that we are just starting now.
Yes, you heard it here first, or you heard it reiterated here first. Okay, great. Now we are getting together for our third time, and I'm very interested in us having some conversations over the coming weeks about perhaps some myths that we all hold or that we come into Vedic astrology with. And I promised that would be the focus of our topic. And then the last two, we've had such great conversations about our own journeys into astrology. But today, I wanted to begin our myth busting series. And I thought I would start by asking you, do you think it's a myth that Vedic astrology is traditional astrology?
Well, let's just start with the idea that all astrology, when it began, was traditional, right?
Yes.
Uh, First, to understand that, we have to understand what is the difference between traditional astrology and what modern astrology is. And there's a lot of things that go on there, but
Yes.
mainly the main thing is that traditional astrology takes as a point of reference a center, by which we understand that the center is everything that transcends, everything that connects us to God or to a spiritual realm, right? Everything that has to do with metaphysical principles that anchor society in a firm place, right? That would be astrology from the traditional point of view, seen as a tool towards that, right? Modern astrology, on the other hand, it has a lot of other technical differences that we're not going on to touch, but modern astrology is a product of the modern world. And the modern world, contrary to the traditional world, takes as a center everything that is economical, that is material, that is, let's say, humanistic, right? And no longer God is the center, but man is the center, right? Humanism, that sort of thing. And as a consequence, everything that has to do with this material world takes a predominance. So that is the difference between traditional and the modern. And every field of human knowledge has been influenced by this, specifically in our Occidental tradition after the 17th, 18th century with the scientific revolutions and obviously the imposition of the heliocentric model, which is very important, not only for astrology, but for everything, right?
Yes.
But that being said, that's a very basic, very
But
crude
that's
introduction.
but that's
Yes.
important because I think this is picking up from what we spoke about last time we got together, which
Yes.
is for yourself when you were attracted to uh, learn more about astrology and you want to invest your learning, you knew that you were looking for traditional astrology.
And I went to Yotish. Yeah.
Exactly. And that's what
Yeah.
yeah. So let's talk about that what can attract people to Vedic astrology.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's
Is
what I
that
mean.
it's
That
traditional.
yeah,
Yeah.
people exactly, and that is a reason why. Thank you for saying that because that's a great intro to what I'm going to say now. And I came into Jyotish believing it was this pure traditional astrology that was part of a religion, which is the spiritual way of the Sanatana Dharma, which is the spirituality of Bharat or Hindustan or India or whatever you want to call it. And I thought, wow, this is the real stuff. But once you go into it, you realize, no, I mean, yes, India has a lot of traditional stuff, and Jyotish has a lot of traditional things. But Jyotish as a whole, as it is practiced today in the 21st century, is not wholly traditional. And,
Yes.
and that was what I started discovering through my studies. Uh, and this idea that Jyotish is the pure astrology and the original astrology is just wrong, right? From an academic perspective, it is wrong. Astrology started developing probably as a whole, as a tangible scientific approach to divination and scientific thought in terms of history by the 8th, 7th century BC. And we have in Chaldea in Babylon, and we have like the gestation of what is going to be Hellenistic astrology, which is the grandmother of all astrologies, which is basically the astrology of planets, houses, signs, aspects, and cusps, specifically the ascendant, came to be in the 2nd century BC, and it didn't coagulate until like the early centuries of the current era, or the era of our Lord Jesus Christ, the 2nd century AD, right? So
Yes.
that is the beginning of astrology from the academic perspective. Now you will hear from Indian, very very reputable people, not people, not crazy people on the street. I mean, academics from India specifically, that's not true. That everything originated in India, and astrology is like 16,000 years old, 10,000 years old, but they don't have any sort of physical evidence, right? They have mathematical hypotheses drawn from traditional texts from the Vedas. But the thing that they don't tell you is that they have different hypotheses in terms of when that was, because what they do is that they use astronomical positions, and then they calculate different times in terms of when was the Mahabharata and that sort of thing. But you don't have records of astrology. And the thing is that Jyotish came to be because of three great movements within Jyotish. You know, Jyotish does have some traditional stuff that is unquestionably Vedic, which is unquestionably traditionally Indian, specifically the nakshatras, and specifically the idea of how the luminaries, the planets, and even the lunar houses, which the lunar mansions, relate to deities and all that. That was like the first part, because Jyotish was never natal astrology. Jyotish within the Vedic context of the Sanatana Dharma as a Vedanga, the sixth discipline where you learn time in order to do the sacrifices. That was what Jyotish was for originally. It was to know when to do the sacrifices, when to do the pujas, when to do the rituals that you learn from the five previous Vedangas, right? So that is the original astrology, but we don't do that. After that, the second development occurred. People say it was after the 2nd century AD, between the 2nd century AD and the 6th century AD. I believe it's between the 2nd and the 4th, probably, where all that knowledge of Hellenistic astrology came into India. And then that's where you have the development of what Jyotish is as a natal astrology. Now, it's still traditional, don't get me wrong, but it is a mixture of both Indian and Hellenistic. And the third and the final movement in terms of what Jyotish was, from a traditional perspective, was the influx of all the Perso-Arab astrology that came after the 8th, 9th century AD. That's where you have Barsafala, solar returns, which is basically the same as the Perso-Arabs did. But you have that development. So you see that the Indian astrology is not 100% pure just by that brief historical outline that I told you. It has influences both from the Hellenistic world, the Javanas, right? Javanas is basically like the foreigners. It relates to the Ionic Sea, which has to do with the Mediterranean. The first astrology book written by Svudishvaya was Javanayataka, which was originally written by Yukteswar, supposedly. We don't know where that book came from, but it's the first book, and that is the origin of the current Jyotish. And then afterwards, you have all the influx from the Perso-Arabs who inherited it from the Hellenistics also. But since the Mediterranean world became Christian, a lot of those pagans moved to Persia, moved to Baghdad, to the Abbasid Caliphate, and then they developed a lot of techniques that went to India. So you have that, right? But even though that's still traditional, it's mixed. But we have to remember that that is not the Jyotish that we practice today entirely, because it is very interesting that all this survived in India, while in the Arab world, in the Mediterranean world, and in the European world, things just fell from fashion. They became underground, while it stayed in the living tradition of India, right? But
Yes.
what happens? Jyotish didn't come into the Western world until the modern world per se was established in the 19th century. It
Yes.
originally was not understood as Vedic astrology. It was called Hindu astrology or Indian astrology, right? Its name is Jyotisha, but it's technically not Jyotisha per se from the old Vedic context. It's just Hindu astrology. And in the 19th century, we started developing this idea of Indian astrology. But in that process of transmission, it became involved with a lot of theosophical interpretations of what astrology was. The idea of putting progress into astrology, of putting evolutionary in a reincarnation into astrology that has nothing to do with the traditional concepts of reincarnation from the Vedic context, right? So basically, you have this nascent form of new Jyotish that is slowly working itself on, right? At the same time, you have this recompilation of Brihad Parashara Hora Shastra that was at the late 19th century. People didn't read the Brihad Parashara Hora Shastra because it was only orally available or in just small parts throughout India. Now, the text per se is a kind of worms, as an academic, I quote, I don't remember his name, but it's a kind of worm because they're different texts and they have different things going on. So the idea that Brihad Parashara Hora Shastra is the greatest text, it's a new text, right? And it has a lot of things from other texts. The five big texts are Brihad Jataka, Shivana Shintamani, Faladipika, Saravali, and Jataka Pariyata. Those are the five big texts. And Brihad Parashara Hora Shastra apparently is either a really old text that became constructed in the 19th century with other texts along the centuries, or just basically something that came up in the 19th century. Either or, the thing is that the five really big texts are those. The thing is that when this started to come up into the 20th century and the Western world, Jyotish started taking another form. And it's not after the war, with the 60s, specifically with these movements of Vaishnavas, of Brahmacharyas, of the ISKCON type, they started reinventing and selling Hinduism to the West. And remember, ISKCON is a good organization. They do good things, but it's like learning about the whole Christian tradition from like Mormons. It's just one perspective of Hinduism. And that had an effect on Western culture, on young men. And we started seeing this phenomenon of Vedic astrology. And it started after the war with the 70s and 60s, and it took a really strong influence in the 80s, right? And from there on, you started seeing the idea of Vedic astrology as a product, right? And it was being taught in a very modern type of way, in emphasizing the idea of past lives, of future lives with the nodes, which is not a traditional Vedic technique. It is a modern technique constructed in the early 20th century. We started seeing developments with the Vargas. Vargas were not used that much on traditional astrology. Old books do not talk about Vargas, and the interpretations of Vargas rely mainly on modern interpretations. At the same time, people were adding Neptune, were adding Uranus, were adding Pluto to the chart. That is not traditional astrology. Even though there's some people who say that supposedly this famous astrology called Naranda Desai, who was in the States. He was an Indian, but he was in the States. I think Chakrapani Ulal also talks about this, that he found an Adi leaf where you see the reference of the Trans-Saturnians. Some people say that the Trans-Saturnians are in the Mahabharata. That is not traditional astrology. So there you have sort of an introduction to the idea of how Vedic astrology per se is not the traditional Jyotisha that we had. And it's not the traditional Jyotisha that came to be with the influence of Hellenistic astrology and Perso-Arab astrology, but it is like something that came out of that got mixed with modern sensibilities and modern interpretations of what progress, evolution is from the modern perspective, where man is the center, where the economical, the material is the center. Remember, Indians do not want to reincarnate. That's why they burn their bodies in the Ganges so they can release it, right? Coming back to life is not something desirable. That's why moksha exists, right? And
Yep.
that's why in the Christian tradition, the kingdom of heaven exists, because you want to, you want to go up. You want to go up, and there are rules to that, right? It's not a free for all like some Vedic modern astrologers emphasize, which is basically a more modern perception. The idea that, oh, I can do anything, I'm just going to be a good person. It's not like that. You got to follow certain rules. In Indian tradition, you don't eat meat. In Indian tradition, you follow certain precepts from the guru. In Christian tradition, you got to follow the commandments. You got to follow the sacraments if you're Catholic. And if you do that, you go up, or you transcend. If you don't do that, you go down. Like they say in the Bhagavad Gita, that if you live a tamasic life, you're going to reincarnate like goats or something like that,
Yes.
and in our tradition, you go to hell. It's more or less the same idea, seen through different perspectives of tradition and religion, seen from this perennial point of view. But in a sense, to conclude already, is that Vedic astrology per se is a construction, is syncretic in its essence, right? And besides that, it has been brought to us, to the Western mind, as the pure astrology, as the real astrology, as the astrology that has not been corrupted. And that is false. As it is false to say that you follow the Elysian mysteries and you are part of a Pythagorean tradition of the ancient Hellenists. That's false. And I mean, the only thing you could say, maybe you can find that today in the 21st century, is some sort of Sufi tradition that might connect you to traditional thought and as a consequence to traditional astrology. But that is very seldom seen today, maybe like 100, 200 years ago. But today, there's no such thing as a purely traditional astrology. We're now reconstructing that, right? And through that reconstruction, we can identify these things that go on in Vedic astrology, as I have commented. And to finish, I don't want to sound negative or anything, but for those who say that, real traditional astrology of the Vedic type of Jyotish, you learn it through a certain parampara, I have to disagree with that, because India has gone through a lot in the past 600 years. You have the Mughal invasions, you have the Islamic invasions, which were probably the most horrible conquest in the history of humanity. Like everything else fades in comparison to what the Muslims did in India with the Indians. And at the same time, you have the English colonization. And as a consequence, the pure paramparas, which were from Brahman to Brahman, they didn't go to Kshatriyas or Vaishyas or Shudras. It was very elitist. They got interrupted. And K.N. Rao talks about that in his book, saying that there are no such thing as pure paramparas. And if somebody postulates that they have a pure parampara, then I recommend you take that with a grain of salt, because probably there's a lot of things going on with the modern interpretations of what Jyotish is. So, that is a very basic introduction that I can say about the topic.
Well, you may call it a very basic introduction, Fernando, but it's complex and there's lots of things
Yes.
going on there. So
Yes.
maybe if we summarize some key moments, perhaps we can say that humans have enjoyed looking at the stars, no matter where they were on the planet or which culture they were born into or what time it was, that there's something about the experience of being on Earth that we enjoy the sky.
Yes.
Yes. And then the exact computations of who saw what and who wrote down what and who transmitted it to whom and what it turned into and then got transmitted to someone else. Obviously, there are cultural baggage parts of that question. But
the difference there is your Weltanschauung, or basically how you see the world. Do you see the world from a traditional perspective where being is superior to becoming, or do you see it from a modern perspective where becoming is superior to being or more important to being? The idea of being planted, which would be the traditional sense, no matter what culture you are or what time period you are, as long as you are planted on the center where the metaphysical principles are the center, or if you are just becoming, just going along with progress, with evolution, that the better things are tomorrow, the revolution will change everything, my politician will do this, my country will do that, and we're just going without a north, right? We're
Yes.
just becoming, perpetually speaking.
I'm smiling because that's definitely going to be another topic for
Oh,
our
yeah, sure.
conversation,
Sure.
being and becoming. But then let's talk about, to summarize part of what you've shared, that although there's this controversial lack of clarity about where things exactly started and who exactly influenced who exactly in which text and who wrote it and all that kind of stuff, what we can say is that a tradition of humanity's understanding of astrology was maintained in India more or less continuously compared to what happened in the Mediterranean. So there's some
Yes.
connection to the past there. But then
But its usage was not what we use it today.
exactly,
It was mainly used by men to set up their rituals, their pujas, their ceremonies.
yes.
And it was an elitist thing to know when to do things for the gods.
Yes, yes. And then in more recent times, Vedic astrology, like many other forms of astrology, has been very influenced by modern culture and our modern view or goals that we superimpose, and we push traditional mythologies or knowledge into telling the stories that we now want to hear. So
And
these
at
are
the
the
same
main
time,
themes. Yes.
and the good thing about that, and I didn't talk about that, it's that the recuperation of the tradition and how we got it. It's like we got that diamond in the rough. We dug it out. It's dirty. Now we have to cut it, we have to polish it, and we have to really get the essence from it. And I think that is something that we've seen in the last decades, and we're gonna see more and more during this century. Not
Yes,
only with Jyotisha, but with Hellenistic astrology, with
exactly.
Muslim astrology, and with medieval and Renaissance European astrology.
Yeah, and in some ways that's enabled by
The internet,
the technology that we have
definitely.
to make charts in the way that we can really quickly make a chart with lots
Oh,
of
full.
possible interpretations and lots of systems and check them quickly. And also we have the internet and all of these YouTube videos that we're all cross pollinating and informing each other, and we can say, I've got this piece of the puzzle, and someone else can say, I've got this piece of the puzzle, and someone else can say, I've got this piece of the puzzle, in a way that we couldn't previously, that these little pieces of the tradition were separated, and now we're in a unique position to bring them together and sort the wheat from the chaff. Like, just because it's survived doesn't mean that it is the true tradition. We still have to test it and see that integrity.
And not only that, using modern astrological ideas, some people say that whenever there's a conjunction of Uranus and Neptune, a new epoch of astrological developments occur. And this is something that has been developed very recently. This idea of the conjunctions of Saturn, of
Yes,
Uranus and Neptune, because they've been
exactly.
recently discovered in the last 250 years. And the last conjunction was in 94, 93. So we're starting to see how now, with all these technologies, with the internet, that knowledge is surfacing, and we are starting to translate, we're starting to talk about certain things, we're starting to really uncover and, myth busting this sort of things.
Yeah.
So, to conclude, I mean, there's, first of all, there's no such thing as a pure traditional astrology, right? There is a reconstruction of what traditional astrology was and what it should be from now on, in terms of looking at the tradition, keeping the tradition, and going with it little by little, right? And there are people who say that Jyotish is like the real, the pure astrology, but that's not necessarily true because of the things I told you about. Now, does Jyotish have traditional elements of astrology? Definitely. But does that mean that astrology began in India? Not necessarily. So more than anything else, we have to start really being critical about Jyotish, as we've been critical about other stuff in terms of the traditional of astrology.
Yes, and this is really the skill of an astrologer, isn't it? And that's what I kind of want to finish with is what you would say to yourself, that young person who went on that journey and thought, oh, I found
Ah,
pure astrology. And now, like, it's an archetypal experience, isn't it? The child who thinks the world is black and white, and
oh
then
no, no.
and
Well,
then
it's.
as the child grows up, realize that there's a lot of gray and there's a lot of murky
I'm
and
gonna give you a better metaphor for that.
great, good. Tell me.
It's the idea that it's like Charlton Heston on Planet of the Apes,
Okay, you'll have to give me more.
where when he gets to the end, where he sees the Statue of Liberty, and he realizes where he is. He's in the future, right? So the metaphor is for us to realize that we are among ruins,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
This is not the. I mean, the modern narrative is that this is the best time in history, that this is the maximum capacity of the
yes,
human mind and the human spirit. No, not necessarily. Yes, we have a lot of technical developments, but I mean, the spiritual, the metaphysical has dwindled, right?
yes,
So we are among ruins, and now we are studying the ruins in
yes,
order to understand them better, in
yes,
order to understand the things that took hold of what were there before the ruins, in
yes,
order for us to try to become germs of the future, right? Of becoming uh, that we lost in being, right? That stop becoming and start being. And that's the thing, we are among ruins, and you have to write it out and look at what things are going on and start, doing that labor, that work of reconstituting what has been forgotten in order for future generations to know where they are standing, I would say. But
yes,
yeah,
yes,
things are not
yes.
black and white, they're gray.
They're great, but I love this analogy because I think we want to honor those people that have kept these
Oh
ruins,
yeah, full.
and what a gift it is for us, the way that we all feel when you visit something ancient and
Exactly.
you honor
Exactly.
that somehow it has survived, and maybe we haven't understood exactly what it even is, but it's ancient, and um it's a conversation from your ancestors. So
Yeah.
we honor all of those traditions that have
and
brought
and
us wealth.
honoring the fire, not the pedestal, because the
Yes,
ruins are of the pedestal, right? The
yes,
idea is for you to get an idea of that in order to take the fire and put it in a new pedestal.
yeah,
And that's the idea, right?
yeah,
And I have no doubt, I'm young, right? I'm young. I'm not super young, but I'm young. But I'm pretty sure that in the following decades,
yeah,
we're gonna see how that starts becoming more concrete. The idea of how a traditional astrology becomes once more.
yes. Wow, great. I
Okay.
love, because we got to the fire and the pedestal last time, so it's like our returning.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
All right, we're here. Fernando, thank you so much for your time.
Oh,
And I
thank
look
you. Thank you.
forward to, because there were many unique details that you shared there about the things that do belong and don't belong. And those are some of the myths that we're going to be busting in the future. I look forward
Okay.
to it.
I hope people like the series.
Thanks. Thank you, Fernando.
You're welcome. Take care.